At 43, I stood in my own kitchen and listened to my daughter-in-law tell my granddaughter that Grandma's house would make a wonderful guest cottage once I was settled somewhere easier. Nobody knew I was standing in the hallway. Nobody knew I'd already met with a lawyer that morning. But what I found in my husband's old filing cabinet 3 days later changed everything. My name is Diane Whitfield, and for 11 years I taught 4th grade at Maple Run Elementary in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place where everyone waves from their porches and the diner still serves coffee in real mugs. I married my husband Gerald the summer after I turned 23, and we built a life out of patience and small kindnesses. Sunday pancakes, a garden he never quite mastered, 2 children we raised to believe that family meant showing up for each other. Gerald passed 6 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, after a long fight with his heart that I never told anyone the full truth about, because some griefs are not for sharing at dinner parties. I kept the house. I kept his name on the mailbox, even after the lawyer told me I didn't have to. I kept teaching until my knees gave out, and the school board offered me an early pension I didn't think I'd need yet. The house itself was nothing extravagant, a 2-story farmhouse on 4 acres just outside town, white clapboard, a wraparound porch Gerald built with his own hands the year our son Mark was born. But it was ours, paid for outright after 20 years of careful budgeting, of clipping coupons and skipping vacations so the kids could go to college without debt. I never resented a minute of it. I loved that house the way you love something that has absorbed every version of yourself you've ever been. The young bride, the exhausted mother, the widow learning to sleep alone in a bed too big for one person. My son Mark lived 40 minutes away with his wife Brittany and their 2 children, Eli and Sophie. My daughter Claire had moved to Charlotte for work and called twice a month, dutifully, like a chore checked off a list. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I was not a perfect mother, and I am not a perfect woman now. I have my stubbornness, my silences, my tendency to keep peace at my own expense. But I gave everything I had to that family, and I never once asked for anything back. That's the thing nobody tells you about sacrifice. It doesn't make people grateful. Sometimes it just makes them comfortable. The trouble started small, the way trouble in families usually does. Brittany began visiting more often that spring, always with a reason, dropping off the kids, bringing over a casserole, just checking in. She'd walk through my house with a particular kind of attention, running her fingers along the banister, studying the crown molding in the dining room, commenting on how much natural light the back bedroom got. At the time, I thought she simply admired the house. I didn't understand yet that she was appraising it. Then came the conversation in May, the one I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd gone out to the garden to cut some early lettuce, and the kitchen window was open, and Brittany's voice carried the way voices do in a quiet house. She was on the phone with someone, laughing lightly, and I heard her say, "Once Diane settled somewhere easier, this place would make the most beautiful guest cottage. Can you imagine the renovation budget we'd have once it's ours?" I stood very still among the lettuce, the scissors loose in my hand, and felt something in my chest go cold and clear at the same time. Settled somewhere easier, as though I were a piece of furniture being relocated for convenience. I didn't say anything that day. I finished cutting the lettuce, washed it at the sink, and made dinner like nothing had happened, because that is what I had trained myself to do for 40 years, absorb the blow and keep moving. But that night, after the house was empty again, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I made a decision that would take me 3 more months to fully understand the weight of. I decided to start paying attention. It is a strange thing, being underestimated by people who love you. They stop being careful around you. They forget you have eyes. Over the following weeks, I noticed things I'd been too generous to notice before, the way Mark had started referring to "when we sell the place" in casual conversation, as though it were already settled. The way Brittany brought a contractor friend just to look at the property for fun, who spent 40 minutes measuring my porch with a laser level while I served them lemonade and smiled. The way my granddaughter Sophie, only 9 years old, asked me one afternoon, completely without malice, "Grandma, when you move to the apartment, can I have your sewing room for my art stuff?" I knelt down and told her, "Of course, sweetheart," not yet knowing what apartment she meant, and feeling something in my stomach drop straight through the floor. That evening I called Claire, hoping she'd tell me I was imagining things, that grief had made me paranoid. Instead, there was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. "Mom," she said finally, careful as a surgeon, "Mark and Brittany have been talking about it for a while. Just options for when things get harder for you. Nobody's decided anything. Nobody's decided anything. I have spent enough years grading essays to recognize a sentence built to hide its subject. Someone had decided something. I simply hadn't been in the room. I want you to understand what it felt like, sitting in the house my husband built, listening to my own daughter tell me, gently, that my children had begun planning my disappearance from my own life." I did not cry. I want to be honest about that too. I have never been a crier in moments that called for tears, and I have cried plenty in moments nobody else would understand. I simply said, "Thank you for telling me," and hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, watching the shape of the garden through the window, thinking about Gerald, about the porch he'd sanded by hand, about every quiet sacrifice that had built this life I was apparently expected to vacate on someone else's timeline. The next morning, I drove into town and sat in the office of a man named Walter Greer, a real estate attorney who had handled Gerald's estate years before and who still somehow remembered the names of both my children. I told him everything: the overheard call, the contractor with the laser level, Sophie's innocent question about the sewing room. Walter listened with his hands folded, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished, he asked me a single question that I have thought about every day since. "Diane," he said, "who actually owns that house?" It was a question I should have already had a clear answer to, and the fact that I hesitated told me something important about how thoroughly I had let other people's assumptions become my own uncertainty. I told him I believed it was mine outright, that Gerald and I had paid off the mortgage years before he died, that the deed should be in both our names, now solely mine through inheritance. Walter nodded slowly and said he'd pull the records to be certain, because in his experience, certainty was the only thing that protected a woman in my position. I left his office that day with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Attention. 3 days later, Walter called and asked me to come back to the office, and something in his voice made me put on real shoes instead of the garden clogs I usually wore into town. When I sat down across from him, he slid a folder across the desk, and what was inside it confirmed what I already suspected, but had been too polite to say aloud. The house was mine, fully, free of any mortgage, solely in my name since Gerald's passing, exactly as I'd believed. There was no shared ownership, no clause, no claim that Mark or Brittany or anyone else could legally make. On paper, nothing had changed, but Walter said something that stayed with me longer than the deed itself. "The law is clear, Diane. The question is whether you're going to let your family's assumptions overrule a truth you already hold in your hand." That was the moment I stopped being a passenger in my own life. I didn't confront anyone yet. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go in people's imaginations. A dramatic scene, raised voices, a door slammed somewhere. That was never going to be me. I have spent my whole life believing that the strongest response to disrespect is not fury, but clarity, and clarity takes preparation. So instead of confronting Mark and Brittany, I went home and did what I do best. I made a plan, quietly, the way I used to plan lesson units back when I taught, methodically, with contingencies, with an eye toward what each piece would teach in the end. I called my old friend Patricia, who had spent 30 years as a paralegal before retiring, and over coffee at her kitchen table, I told her everything. Patricia, never one to mince words, said exactly what I needed to hear. "Diane, you've spent your whole life being generous with people who mistake your kindness for weakness. It's time they learned the difference." Together, we drew up a plan. I would set the house and its surrounding 4 acres into a properly structured living trust, naming myself as sole trustee and beneficiary during my lifetime, with clear, binding terms about what would happen afterward, terms that protected my grandchildren's future without handing control to anyone who saw me as an obstacle to a renovation budget. Walter drafted the documents. I signed them on a Tuesday morning in his office, the pen steady in my hand, the early June light falling across the desk, the same way it had fallen across Gerald's coffin 6 years before. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I called the school district and asked whether they still needed substitute teachers for the fall term. I had more energy than my family seemed to think I did, more sharpness than the word settled implied. Within 2 weeks, I was back in a classroom 3 days a week, not because I needed the money, but because I needed badly to remember that I was a person with a present tense, not simply a problem to be relocated in someone else's future tense. The brochure arrived on a Thursday in July, addressed to me, sitting innocently among the bills and a seed catalog. Sunny Meadows Senior Residences, the cover read, beneath a photograph of smiling, silver-haired strangers playing cards in a sun-drenched common room. I stood at my own mailbox and turned it over in my hands and felt the particular, specific sting of realizing that someone had requested information be sent directly to my home in my name, without ever once having the courage to ask me a question to my face. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and let it sit there for 3 days like evidence waiting for trial, because that, I had come to understand, was exactly what it was. When I finally called Mark, I kept my voice light, almost curious. "I got the strangest brochure in the mail today," I said. "Sunny Meadows, do you know anything about that?" The silence on the line lasted just a beat too long. "Mom," he said, "we just thought, with the property being so much to maintain, that it might be good to start looking at options, just to have information." Options. There was that word again. The same vague, padded language Claire had used weeks before, the language people use when they've already made a decision and are only now backfilling it with the appearance of your consent. I told him I appreciated him thinking of me, and I meant it with a kind of irony I didn't bother explaining. And I hung up the phone and looked at that brochure for a long time, understanding now with total clarity that the contractor's laser level, Sophie's innocent question, Brittany's phone call in the garden, none of it had been coincidence. It had been a campaign, gentle and deniable, built entirely on the assumption that I would simply go along the way I always had. I thought about confronting them privately, one conversation at a time, the way a reasonable woman is supposed to handle these things, but I had spent 40 years handling things quietly, privately, in ways that protected everyone's comfort but my own, and I had watched where that road led, straight to a brochure in my mailbox and a contractor measuring my porch for someone else's renovation. My mother used to say that some truths are too important to whisper, that there are moments meant to be said once, clearly, in front of everyone who needs to hear them, so that nobody can later claim confusion. I decided that Labor Day, when the whole family would gather at my house, as they did every year for the cookout Gerald had started back when Mark was still in high school, would be exactly that moment. I spent the weeks leading up to it the way I imagine a general spends the weeks before a campaign, calm on the surface, completely prepared underneath. I had Walter draw up clean copies of the trust documents. I asked Patricia to be present that day, not to speak, just to witness, because some moments deserve a witness who isn't emotionally entangled in the outcome. I bought groceries for the cookout exactly as I always had, made my potato salad exactly as I always had, set the long table on the porch exactly as Gerald and I had set it for 20 cookouts before. From the outside, nothing about that Labor Day looked any different from the ones before it. That was precisely the point. They arrived throughout the early afternoon the way families do, Mark and Brittany first, with Eli and Sophie tumbling out of the car, already arguing about whose turn it was for the tire swing. Claire an hour later, looking tired from the drive, hugging me a beat longer than usual, which told me she at least carried some private guilt about the conversation she'd had with me weeks before. My brother-in-law Frank came with a cooler of soda. The Hendersons from next door wandered over the way they always did, drawn by the smell of the grill. By 4 o'clock, the porch was full of the particular noise of a family that has not yet realized it is about to change. I waited until the food was nearly finished, until the children had been excused to play in the yard, and the adults had settled into that loose, satisfied quiet that follows a good meal. Brittany was telling a story about a friend's kitchen renovation, gesturing animatedly, and I noticed Mark glance at me once, quickly, almost guiltily, before looking away. It was Frank, of all people, who unknowingly opened the door I'd been waiting for, asking innocently whether I'd given any more thought to downsizing, since he'd heard from somebody that I'd been sent some brochures. I set down my glass of iced tea very deliberately. I want you to understand that I did not raise my voice. I have never once in my life found that raising my voice made a truth land any harder than saying it plainly. Actually, I said, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's time we talked about it properly, as a family, instead of around me. The porch went quiet, in that particular way, A room goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen, that it cannot stop. Brittany's smile flickered and held. Mark set down his fork. I told them everything, calmly, the way I used to explain a difficult math concept to a classroom of 9-year-olds, slowly, clearly, without apology. I told them I'd overheard the phone call in May, the one about the guest cottage and the renovation budget. I watched Brittany's face go pale and then defensive, watched her start to say, "Diane, that's not," before I continued gently but without stopping, because I had learned that the only way to finish a sentence in this family was to simply keep talking. I told them about the contractor with the laser level. I told them about Sophie's question about the sewing room, which made Claire's eyes fill with sudden tears, because even she, I think, hadn't fully understood how far it had gone. And then I told them about the brochure, and I reached beside my chair and lifted it onto the table, Sunny Meadows Senior Residences, smiling up at all of them in the late afternoon light. I want to be very clear about something, I said, and here my voice did change, not louder, but firmer, the way a teacher's voice changes when a lesson matters. This house was built by your father's hands and paid for by both of our backs, dollar by dollar, for 20 years. It is mine, free and clear, and it has been mine alone since the day he died. Nobody in this family has ever had a legal claim to it, and as of 3 months ago, nobody ever will, because I have placed it in a trust that protects it for Eli and Sophie's futures. Not for renovation budgets, not for guest cottages, and not for whatever plans were being made for me behind my back. Mark's face had gone a kind of ashen color I'd never seen on him before. "Mom, it wasn't like that," he started, but I held up a hand, not unkindly, the way I used to quiet a classroom before a difficult conversation. "I know exactly what it was like," I said. "I heard it with my own ears in my own garden. And I want you to understand something else. I am not angry that you thought about the future. I am not even angry that you wanted this house someday. It's a beautiful house, and someday it will belong to your children, properly, through a trust that protects them no matter what anyone tries to do later. What I am is heartbroken that none of you thought I deserved to be part of the conversation about my own life." Claire was openly crying now, her hand pressed to her mouth. Brittany had gone very still, staring at the brochure on the table as though it might somehow defend itself. Frank looked like a man who deeply regretted opening his mouth 20 minutes earlier. I told them then about Patricia, sitting quietly at the end of the table, who confirmed in a few calm sentences that everything I'd said about the trust was true and binding, witnessed properly, filed with the county. I told them that I had gone back to substitute teaching, not because I needed the income, but because I needed, urgently, to prove to myself that I was still a woman with a future tense, not a problem waiting to be solved by other people's timelines. And I told them, finally, the thing that I think mattered most, the thing I had turned over in my mind for 3 months before I was ready to say it out loud. I raised both of you to take care of each other, and I am proud of the parents you've become to my grandchildren. But somewhere along the way, you started treating my kindness like it was something you were entitled to, instead of something I freely gave. And kindness without boundaries, I have learned, is just a door left unlocked for anyone who wants to walk through it uninvited. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Sophie's laughter drifted up faintly from the yard, oblivious, and the late summer light had turned that deep amber color that makes everything look like a memory, even while you're standing inside it. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "Mom, I'm sorry, I don't know what to say." Brittany said nothing at all, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of the campaign had actually been hers. I didn't ask for an apology that day, and I want you to understand why. An apology offered out of shock, in front of an audience, with a brochure sitting exposed on the table, is not the same as genuine understanding, and I have lived long enough to know the difference. I simply told them that the trust was filed, the house was protected, and that I expected, going forward, to be asked about my own life rather than informed of decisions already made on my behalf. Then I stood up, collected the empty serving dishes, and went inside to start the dishes, because some truths, once spoken clearly, don't need to be lingered over to have done their work. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no lawsuit, no shouting match, no slammed door. Brittany stopped visiting as often, and when she did, she was noticeably more careful, more deferential, a woman who had learned the hard way that quiet people are not the same as powerless ones. Mark called more, actually called, not just texted, and slowly, over months, our conversations began to feel less like status updates and more like the kind of talk a son has with his mother when he actually wants to know how she's doing. Claire drove up one weekend in October, just the two of us, and we sat on the porch with tea, and she finally said the thing I think had been sitting in her chest since Labor Day. I should have told you the truth the first time you called me about it. I'm sorry I let you find out the hard way. I told her that the hard way had, in the end, taught me something about myself that the easy way never would have. I had spent 40 years believing that my worth was measured by how much I could give without complaint. It took a brochure in my mailbox to teach me that worth and self-erasure are not the same thing. I made sure Eli and Sophie understood, in age-appropriate terms over the following year, that the house would always be there for them, that nothing about what happened was about punishing anyone, that grandmothers can hold both love and boundaries in the same open hand. Sophie still has her art corner in the sewing room, except now it's because I cleared a space for her myself, as a gift freely given, not a concession extracted through someone else's planning. There's a particular kind of peace in that distinction that I don't think I could have explained to anyone before that Labor Day, and I'm not sure I needed to explain it to anyone after either. They understood it the moment they watched me set that brochure on the table, and not flinch. Walter still handles the trust paperwork every year, a quiet formality, now rather than a battle. Patricia and I still have coffee every Thursday, and she likes to remind me, with a satisfied little smile, that she always knew I had a spine of iron under all that politeness. I'd simply never needed to use it before. I'm 61 now, still substitute teaching 2 days a week because I like it, still tending Gerald's garden, still sitting on that porch most evenings with a cup of tea and the particular kind of quiet that comes from a life finally, fully, your own again. The house still smells like cedar and old wood and the lemon polish I've used for 30 years. It is still, and will always be for as long as I have breath, exactly what it was the day Gerald built that porch with his own 2 hands. Not a guest cottage, not an asset to be appraised, not a problem to be solved by people who loved me, but had forgotten how to ask. It is mine. And now, finally, everyone in my family knows it the same way I do. I think about that overheard phone call sometimes, out in the garden among the lettuce, and I no longer feel the cold anger it gave me that spring morning. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because it forced me to stop being the version of myself that absorbed every quiet erasure without comment. I didn't stop being a mother that Labor Day. I didn't stop being generous or patient or the woman who still makes too much potato salad for every family gathering out of habit and love. I simply stopped being furniture in the rooms of my own life. Quiet people don't explode, I've come to understand. They clarify. And once the truth is spoken clearly enough, just once, in front of everyone who needs to hear it, it never has to be spoken that loudly again,